So here we're going to be discussing paraphrasing. Paraphrasing, of course, is an important skill to avoid being accused of copying or plagiarizing. However, it is often very difficult because, first of all, it involves a lot of sophisticated sub-skills. For example, choosing alternative vocabulary or rearranging the syntax of a sentence in order to transform it from the original model. Plus, sometimes you're going to need to know when you still have to use quotation marks even though you paraphrased. And the other problem is that it's not always clear what is appropriate paraphrasing. Sometimes people have said, well, you have to make the sentence your own. But what does that mean? And so teachers often create artificial rules like no more than copying 3 words in one sentence. However, sometimes inevitably you copy more than 3 words, and sometimes only 1 word might be considered to be inappropriate, depending on the nature of that word. So, let's look at this sentence. It's from an article that I wrote. Making the appropriate choices regarding reporting verbs is integral in making what classical rhetoricians call kairos, the creation of appropriate argument at the appropriate time, a point that has frequently been ignored in the teaching of L2 composition. So let's look at some of the vocabulary. Appropriate. Now, that's a word that probably has a lot of synonyms, so you need to be able to choose a word that is different than appropriate but still means approximately the same thing. A word like reporting verbs, on the other hand, is a very specific word and therefore probably cannot be paraphrased or to find another word. So you would probably just leave it as it is. A word like kairos, on the other hand, is even more specific and it's more unusual word to use. It's a Greek word. And so sometimes you might need to put that in quotation marks in order to show that you took that specific word from the author you are paraphrasing. So let's give a very simple example. Making the appropriate choices. It's fairly easy to paraphrase that as choosing, and that's probably better than what I originally had written. An appropriate argument at the appropriate time. That's a little more complicated to paraphrase. I mean, the important thing is the appropriate argument. That's probably the more important aspect of that claim. So that would be the area where you may need to focus on. And a point that has frequently been ignored in the teaching of L2 composition, that's probably less important. Therefore, this is an area, phrase that you more likely will just ignore and cut out. So choosing the right reporting verb is important for creating the appropriate argument at the appropriate time. So here we did 2 things. One is we didn't really find a good word for appropriate, so we chose the word right. But right doesn't quite fit there. It doesn't quite fit grammatically there, but more importantly, the meaning is somewhat different. Because with reporting verbs, there's not necessarily a right reporting verb. There's only one that expresses what you are thinking about. Therefore, appropriate is the better word. So because right isn't exactly the correct word, we put it in quotation marks. And the appropriate argument at the appropriate time. So here the writer may have liked this expression, and rather than try to paraphrase it, since it's fairly succinct, some may be easier if you can't paraphrase it to simply put it in quotes. The problem, of course, is you can't do this very often, particularly in fields like science or engineering, where you rarely ever see the use of quotation marks. So, given that you may now have a paraphrased sentence, we would like you to add the attribution. Now, in different fields, attribution is done in different ways. But here, what we want you to do is take the name of the author and add the reporting verb. In this case, argues. And we'll discuss why argues is an appropriate choice. So, Bloch argues that choosing the right reporting verb is important for creating what he calls kairos. And let me explain why I added the expression he calls, because sometimes Bloch may not be right about his definition of kairos, and you may not be sure that Bloch is right. So you're saying he calls this kairos. You may or may not agree, because it may not be a clear point. So you cite Bloch again a second time in the sentence. You say he calls kairos along with Bloch argues. Bloch are choosing the right reporting verb, and here right is in quotation marks, is important for creating the appropriate argument at the appropriate time. So this is a slight variation on it. We keep the word right, put it in quotation marks, again, and the appropriate argument at the appropriate time. And there's a lot of quotation marks, and some people may not find that appropriate. But here, in this case, in some ways, it's a better strategy than trying to copy words without the quotation marks and perhaps crossing that imaginary line into what is inappropriate paraphrasing.